Hi there, I'm Alex Grzankowski. I'm a senior lecturer at Birkbeck in the Department of Philosophy, and I'm happy to be joined here today by Lauren Slater, who's a current PhD at Birkbeck, and with Stu James, who's a professor of philosophy also here at Birkbeck. And we're going to be talking today about Margaret Cavendish. And maybe I could just start with Stu. Could you tell us just a little bit about who Cavendish is?
Yeah, Margaret Cavendish is a 17th century philosopher. She was born in 1623 and she lived to be 50, so you can situate her there. She is one of a few women who write philosophy in the 17th century, but she is the only one who writes several systematic treatises of philosophy and publishes them. So she really is a very important figure as a woman philosopher in this era. Cavendish had also a richly colourful life. As a very young woman, she married a much older English aristocrat, the Marquis of Newcastle, William Cavendish, his name was, who was part of a sort of important philosophical circle, first of all in England, where he was very closely connected with Hobbes, among other people. And then when this whole household went into exile during the Civil War, he made many connections with French philosophers in Paris. So Descartes and Gassendi and Mersenne and so forth were all the people around them. He was a very lively interlocutor with these people. So was his brother, Charles Cavendish, who was an important mathematician. And William Cavendish was interested in experimental philosophy, and he collected and used microscopes. So they did lots of experimental work as well as theoretical work. So enter Margaret Cavendish, the much younger wife of this man, and she begins to write. And first of all, she writes poems and plays and fictions and orations, political works, all sorts of things. And then she gradually comes to write philosophy. And she says, I resolved to argue only with famous and subtle philosophers. So she takes on the really big guns of the time. She argues with Hobbes and with Descartes and with the Platonist Henry More and with the kind of alchemical philosopher Van Helmont. Not all these names are still very known to us, but they were all really important at the time. And she publishes books about experimental philosophy of the kind done in the Royal Society in England. She takes on, as I said, more speculative philosophies of the sort that you find in Descartes, and becomes quite famous, publishes these books herself. Towards the end of her life is invited to attend a meeting of the Royal Society, where all these people who she is rather critical of look at her, I think, with some suspicion, and achieves, as it were, a sort of curious reputation. She is a remarkable person. People don't know quite what to think of her. But she has remained really the greatest woman in the English early modern canon for philosophy.
All right, that's really helpful and high praise. So just to clarify, she's spending time with Hobbes and Descartes.
Yes, it's not clear how much she talked to them. She says she didn't talk to them at all, but she was certainly around when they were talking. She seems to have been an extremely shy woman, so she did most of her work thinking and writing, not talking.
Yeah, well, it's a pretty good crowd of big names to be around. She gets to be associated with some of the greats. That's really good.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good place to sort of dig into the philosophy a little bit more. So Hobbes is a materialist and Descartes is a dualist, and they're sort of coming at philosophy in this mechanistic worldview. And my understanding is that Cavendish has got quite an interesting take or intervention into that mechanistic worldview. Lauren, maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's probably accurate to say that Cavendish was also a materialist, but she has a really different kind of conception of matter, what matter is. In fact, she has this view where matter is made up of 3 parts, or she says 3 degrees of matter. So those are the first, which is inanimate matter or dull matter. The second is sensitive matter, and the third is rational matter. So let's talk about how those 3 things are distinguished. The first distinction that Cavendish makes is between inanimate matter, the first kind, and then animate matter, which are the second 2 kinds. She says that dull or inanimate matter doth of itself lie still, she says. So the second kinds, the sensitive and the rational matter, are animate. They are self-moving, she says. So I think perhaps one way we can talk about the way in which these 3 types of matter, or the 3 degrees of matter, are related to each other is through an analogy. In fact, she gives several analogies to try and describe this 3-part view of matter, and many of them seem to involve kind of social rank or hierarchy. So she compares the rational matter to an architect, the sensitive matter to the workman, she says always busily employed, and the dull matter is compared to the materials used by the workman, so like wood or stone. So we have this kind of relation going on between the rational matter, the sensitive, and then the dull matter or the inanimate matter. Another analogy she makes is to compare the rational matter to the master of a ship, the sensitive matter to the sailors, and the inanimate matter to the ship itself. So we have this same sort of social rank or hierarchy kind of going on between these 3 parts of matter. So we can say that the rational matter kind of directs or guides the sensitive matter, and the sensitive matter employs the inanimate matter kind of in its motion. And the other thing to note, of course, is that in virtue of the rational matter, all of matter, she thinks, is perceiving, can perceive, and also is knowledgeable, can possess knowledge. One other crucial thing we must note about matter, about Cavendish's conception of matter, is that all of these 3 kinds, all of these 3 degrees of matter are mixed together, so that any piece of matter you could have would contain all 3 kinds. So this kind of view sets her apart from dualists like Descartes, who of course say that matter by itself isn't rational or perceptive or could have knowledge. And the other thing, I suppose, that is really interesting about her view is the way in which she thinks that bodies, about the way in which matter kind of relates to other parts of matter. So Descartes, of course, has this sort of quite mechanistic, as we said, this mechanistic view where the relationship between bodies is one where they can cause motion in each other by kind of bumping into each other, that motion can be transferred between bodies by a kind of contact. This is, I mean, that's a very simplistic way to describe it, but this is the kind of view that we see in Descartes. Cavendish has a very, very different view. She doesn't think that this is the way that motion is transferred between bodies. And in fact, she thinks that motion being transferred between bodies isn't really possible. So yes, quite a different view from the mechanistic worldview we get from Descartes.
Yeah, so would you say Descartes a dualist? He thinks that there's mind and there's body, and that these things are importantly distinct. Would you say Cavendish is a trialist? Is it almost like there are these 3 different things so there seems to be a different kind of division, but you also said that matter can have all of these different, you didn't use the word properties, but I'll use the word properties. How should we think about sort of the kind of division that you see in Descartes, where you get a dualism, and this kind of division in Cavendish? Is it the same kind of thing, or is she doing something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think she is doing something else. So of course, the view that we get in Descartes is that mind and body are distinct kinds of substance. They're just entirely different kinds of things. that of course, you know, we have the famous interaction problem of how on earth these two very, very different kinds of things can you know, cause changes in each other. That's his problem that he has to worry about. I suppose with Cavendish, the sort of this distinction between these three parts of matter, or 3 degrees of matter, I suppose degrees is going to be a helpful word for us. I think she thinks that, you know, matter is one, but that we can identify these 3 kind of degrees, or 3 I don't think it's the kind of distinction when we have completely different kinds of thing. And yes,
it's not a substance division.
No, it's not a substance division. Yes, and as you rightly said, that any piece of matter, she thinks, you know, no matter how small, is going to have all 3. So they're all so together that they're effectively one, that can be, you know, the differentiation is by degree rather than a completely different kind of thing.
Yeah. Sue, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I think Lauren just brought out beautifully how Cavendish is a kind of materialist, a very odd kind of materialist, because as well, everything, or from our point of view, an odd kind of materialist. But, you know, everything has to be, as we're packed into this notion of matter. And so all our capacities and powers and properties are properties of matter, as far as she is concerned. And sometimes I think I'm right in saying, you know, she tries to level this, sort of cash this out in terms of motion by saying, you know, that there are sort of differences of speed and fineness of quality among the parts and things of that sort, which correlate with these 3 levels. But that's not for her what's really doing the explanatory work. Yeah.
I would like to hear a little bit more about the way Cavendish is thinking about the relationship between mind and body and cause. But maybe before we get into the specifics of that, or maybe even working through a kind of example, do either of you think that Cavendish is in a better position when it comes to something like the mind-body problem? So that's a problem that I think probably lots of people will have some familiarity with, and it's handed down to us maybe earlier, but certainly from Descartes, that we've got this one kind of substance and it's kind of not of the same sort as this other kind of substance, and this is where the mechanistic stuff happens, and somehow this is supposed to have a causal impact, and we're meant to find it very mysterious how that's supposed to work. Is Cavendish in a better position, do you think, than the substance dualist?
Lauren, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess she's. I don't think that is. I suppose is really her problem, or at least explained in that way, because as we said, it's not that she has to explain a relation between 2 completely different or 3 completely different kinds of things. So she doesn't have the same problem as Descartes, where we have these kind of 2, yes, as you said, completely different kinds of substance that don't share any kind of qualities at all, that just completely different categories of stuff. But I suppose, as Sue said, I think that's a really nice way to put it, that everything's kind of packed into matter, that all of our capacities, everything that we observe and everything that we're able to do is packed into this this conception of matter. And so exactly how that's supposed to work is her mystery, I think.
Yeah, so let's dig in a little bit more on the kind of relationship between mind and body for Cavendish. So maybe it would be helpful to sort of just go through an example. How is she thinking about causation? You sort of mentioned a little bit about that, but maybe you could tell us more with an example.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, in contrast to somebody like Descartes, who thinks that the interaction between bodies happens sort of with a kind of physical contact and a sort of preservation of motion. This is something that he talks about in his Principles of Philosophy. and in various letters with various interlocutors, famously with Henry Moore, who Sue mentioned earlier as well. Cavendish thinks that there's a big problem with that. So this is something that she is critical of. She criticizes Descartes for this kind of view. So she thinks that motion is sort of identified with animate matter. She doesn't think that motion can exist separately from animate matter, that is the sensitive and the rational kinds of the degrees of matter. So since she thinks that it's impossible to conceive of motion as separate, she thinks that if motion were going to be transferred from one body to the other, then it would have to do so sort of with a part of the body, right? So you'd have to have a situation where if one body was sort of causing motion in another, then some of the first body would end up in the second body, which she thinks is absurd, because it would just mean that the first body would get smaller and smaller as it caused motion in the second. She says, this is a quote from her philosophical letter. She says, "For how can motion, being no substance but only a mode, quit one body and pass into another?" She thinks that motion is just kind of a way a body is, right, rather than a thing by itself. It's not a substance by itself, and so it can't quit one body and pass into another. It's not that the motion, which is just a way of being, can hop from one to the other, and so it would have to do that within a body, which means that we get this absurd kind of conclusion, that this absurd consequence that matter is sort of transferred from cause to effect. She thinks about an example here, which is the hand and the ball. So she thinks about a hand throwing the ball. And I'll just read you a little thing that she says about this. She says, "The motion by which, for example, the ball is moved is the ball's own motion, and not the hand's that threw it. For the hand cannot transfer its own motion, which has a material being, out of itself and into the ball, or any other thing it handles, touches, or moves. Or else, if it did, the hand would in a short time become weak and useless by losing so much substance." So she says of the ball that the motion of the ball, when I throw a ball with my hand, not that that's something I do very often, but if I were to, the motion of the ball is entirely its own. So there's no transfer of motion from the hand to the ball. Instead, and this is where the kind of the rational aspect of matter comes in. Instead, she thinks that what happens is that the ball perceives my hand and responds to it rationally. So she thinks that the ball sees the hand moving and knows, in accordance with the kind of harmony of nature, that what it ought to do now is move in that particular way. It triggers the ball to author its own motion. The hand is just the occasion for the ball to do that. And so we get this sort of quite lovely picture, I think, of motion, of matter, all being kind of in constant communication with everything else. So we have this, this really lovely idea, I think, that all of the bodies are perceiving each other and responding in a kind of rational way, in accordance with the kind of the harmony of nature. And so this is where we get the kind of, I guess, the rational aspect of matter.
That's in some ways kind of a peculiar sounding picture. How much of it is metaphor and how much of it is literal? I mean, suppose I've got a tennis ball in my hand. It certainly, I think it would be a stretch to say that the tennis ball has sense organs. It's not the sort of thing that can see another object the way that I do with my eyes. Does Cavendish sort of mean this literally, or is it meant to be a bit of a metaphor when she says that it perceives the hand?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think to an extent, she means it literally. Of course, she doesn't think that that the ball sort of has eyes in the same way that we do. So it's going to be a very different kind of sensational perception. It's going to be sort of really quite different. But nevertheless, I think she does really think that that there is perception and rational response going on in all of matter. Of course, the extent to which sort of we sort of use our reason and have our sensations, that's kind of up the scale, sort of quite up the scale in terms of the concentration of the rational and the sensitive matter, I think, for her. But to a sort of a much lesser degree, she does think that the ball too has this capacity for perception and for rational response. And I think I suppose for her, she thinks that to have the view like Descartes, she thinks leads to something even more absurd. She just thinks that, well, I mean, then you'd throw a few balls and you'd end up with no hand. I guess she thinks that that's more absurd than thinking that the ball to some extent can perceive the hand that throws it.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting, and I think that maybe I'll ask Sue this question. I mean, it's reminiscent of, well, given the timeline, reminiscent is not quite the right word, but panpsychism is sort of a view right now in philosophy of mind that is getting a lot of attention. It's kind of back on the scene, and people have this idea that matter is itself conscious. Consciousness is ubiquitous. It's primitive and it's everywhere. This sounds a little bit like that. Would you say Cavendish is a panpsychist, or is that maybe not quite a fair comparison?
I think she is, yes. Maybe it's important to remember that our sort of historically formed view of the 17th century very much focuses on Descartes. He's always, this is where we start. And so we think of this as a century where, as it were, the interest in the difference between mind and matter is predominant. And of course, that's not entirely wrong. But it is also very important to remember that there was a huge range of views about matter and substance and thinking and perception in the 17th century as since, and that Cavendish is one of a number of people who are certainly vitalists. And so there they are in lots of perhaps more famous company, somebody like Spinoza, for example, but also much less famous company, more in Cavendish's close circle, where there are lots of people who think that, as well, everything is alive. And for us, well, perhaps I can say this, that for them, the really crucial question, and it's exactly what Lauren's been bringing out, is, does a thing have the capacity to direct its own motions and determine its path through the world? And we think that that's a capacity which is lodged in only rather few things. And I think that's part of our Cartesian heritage. We think about mind as being associated with consciousness, and our consciousness being the really crucial thing about what it is to have a mind. I think for early moderns, it's much more important to ask, is a thing active in the sense of, does it have the power to determine its own progress, as it were, its own course of action? And it comes very naturally to them to think that lots of things clearly have that, and then they sort of push on down. So Cavendish says, for example, that we just don't know anything about the perception of rocks and ferns and things like that, but it would be ridiculous to infer from that they didn't have any. So and then, as Lauren's been saying, she thinks that all things have these three grades of matter. So all things have this kind of matter rational matter, she's calling it, which is traditionally associated with reasoning and with willing, and are to some degree able to direct themselves in that sense. And for her, I think, as it were, that's to have some of that matter is enough to give you at least a little inkling of mind, if that makes sense.
It sounds like one sort of interesting upshot of this kind of picture is that not only is everything alive in some sense, but it sounds a bit like everything is a subject and is guided by sort of rationality. And I mean, if that's right, does that mean that we have a kind of different responsibility to rocks and stones and trees and ants than we might have thought? I mean, I suppose one of the things that comes out of the kind of Cartesian picture, which at least 200 or 300 years ago was really, really horrible, was a bad treatment of animals on the grounds that they didn't have the kind of things like we do, a soul, that makes them the kind of thing that we should be kind to and not be causing pain in, or they're not even the right sorts of things to feel pain. But we've given up that kind of picture. Cavendish's view seems to push us much, much further down that path. Is that fair, or am I kind of barking up the wrong tree?
I think it is fair, and it goes back to what Lauren was saying about this view of nature as a harmonious whole. Recently I was watching a bit of Attenborough's Green Planet and learning a tiny bit more about these vast range of sensitivities and powers that plants have. And I felt that, as it were, now I'm getting back a bit of the view of the world that comes very naturally to Cavendish and to her contemporaries. They see the world as really full of things with their own powers and capacities to respond and direct themselves. And we learn now that this is much more so in the case of plants than we knew until recently. And so, you can kind of work your way into how they end up thinking, yeah, that's how everything is. And it does bring with it a sense of, well, at least the question you ask about responsibility is really interesting, Alex, because I'm not sure that they feel, so we have a responsibility to, as it were, kind of think about plants in the way that we think about each other. On the contrary, as you say, the 17th century seems to take a very, as it were, kind of strict theological view that humans are one thing and the rest of nature is another. But we might use this view in a different way.
Yeah, that's I think a really nice kind of message that comes out of the metaphysical picture. Maybe just one last question. It's nice to be able to sort of chat about Cavendish and to get a flavor for the sort of view. But suppose someone wanted to go away now and have a look at something that Cavendish wrote. What would be your tip for the first place to go for a closer look? Maybe I'll start with Lauren.
Okay. I think. I really particularly love the way that she writes, and of course she didn't just, as Sue said, she didn't just write philosophy text. She also wrote fiction, poetry, and things like that. But if somebody had a sort of philosophical interest in Cavendish, I think I would start with the letters. I really like the letters. I think they're a good place to start.
Good. That's a good hot tip. Sue, do you think the letters is the right place to start, or maybe you've got another option?
No, I think the letters is the quickest way into Cavendish's, as it were, sort of philosophical interests. It's also just interesting perhaps to remember that Cavendish wrote about politics and political philosophy as well. And by far her most famous book is a kind of fiction called The Blazing World. And this was meant to be the counterpart to her work on experimental philosophy. So some of it is a kind of reiteration of some of her views about philosophy, but they're all portrayed in a fictional frame, and it's a very entertaining read.
Well, that's great. That sounds like it's plenty to keep people busy. Lauren and Sue, thank you very much for joining me. It's really interesting to hear more about Margaret Cavendish.
Thanks so much, Alex.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks, Lauren.